History is written by the victors. This your story. Take off.
Look, this is his story. Everything a true story.
So what if I told you that during his lifetime, no one called Isaac Newton a scientist? The same is true for Copernicus, Galileo, and Kepler. No one called them scientists during their lifetime. Although many of us have been taught that these individuals were scientists, the fact of the matter is that these individuals were not called scientists during their lifetime, but rather they were called natural philosophers. The word scientist was not coined until the mid-1800s by a man named William Whewell. Prior to that, the endeavor that we now think of as science occurred within a field called natural philosophy, which combined concepts that we now associate with science with concepts related to spirituality, religion, mysticism, and the occult. So I wanted to provide a definition and timeline of natural philosophy and science in Western civilization so we can visualize, 1, how long natural philosophy, that is science mixed with concepts related to spirituality, persisted in Western civilization relative to modern science. 2, identify the ways in which various natural philosophers and scientists throughout history and Western civilization mixed concepts related to science and spirituality. 3, find out if it was natural philosophy, that is science mixed with spirituality, or quote-unquote science that Europe was following at the time when they colonized and enslaved Africa. 4, identify if and when Western civilization ever completely separated science from spirituality. And 5, answer the question, can you mix science and spirituality? So let's start with the timeline. And I tried to represent this to scale. So at the time of this video, it's almost the year 2024. It's December 2023. Thales, who was called the father of Western natural philosophy, got started around 600 BC. So this timeline represents about 2,624 years of history in Western civilization. The word scientist gets introduced in 1834 by William Whewell, but natural philosophy still persisted until about 1867. So you have from 600 BC to 1867 as the time of natural philosophy, which is 2,467 years. And then you have from 1834 to present, which is 2024 at the time of this video, you have from 1834 to present of science, which is 190 years. So about 93% of the timeline represents natural philosophy, colored here in red, and 7% of the timeline represents science, colored in blue, with 33 years or about 1% of the timeline colored in purple as the overlap between natural philosophy and science. Prior to the year 1834, when the Latin word scientia was used, it was referring just to knowledge in general. So before 1834, the phrase a man of science was synonymous with a knowledgeable man. Modern scholars have used post hoc rationalization to call the natural philosophers who existed prior to 1834 scientists when they were not called scientists during their time. Right, so let's get started. So let's define natural philosophy. Natural philosophy is the philosophical study of physics, that is the study of nature and the physical universe. It was dominant before the development of modern science. From the ancient world until the 19th century, natural philosophy was the common term for the study of physics or nature, a broad term that included botany, zoology, anthropology, and chemistry, as well as what we now call physics. It was in the 19th century, after William Whewell introduced the word scientist, that the concept of science received its modern shape, with different subjects emerging within science, such as astronomy, biology, and physics. However, the term natural philosophy was still used years after the introduction of the word scientist.
Hello, and welcome to our new series, Crash Course History of Science. My name is Hank Green. In fact, plot twist, the early scientists who adopted the creed nullius in verba were not actually scientists. They were well-off alchemists and medical doctors, and they called themselves natural philosophers, or people who loved truths concerning the world around them. Natural philosophy in 17th century England was sort of like contemporary natural sciences mashed up with medicine, mathematics, some philosophy, and a whiff of religion. The word scientist was only coined recently in historical terms in the 1830s and caught on around 1840. It was made up by an English scientist named William Whewell, who was also a historian of science and a priest. So if we only cared about the history of people people called scientists, our job would be easy. There aren't any until around 1840. We can see natural philosophers and other proto-scientists as amazingly smart people making sense of their world, not as like bad scientists. They understood the world around them in the smartest way they could. At its limit, the history of science touches on the study of religion, the diverse and changing nature of the never-ending human search for truth with a capital T.
So let's get started at the beginning of the timeline in 600 BC with ancient Greece. So when you do a cursory study of the history of natural philosophy in Greece, you can be inclined to believe that the ancient Greeks separated science from spirituality because you will read lines like the following. Philosophical and specifically non-religious thought about the natural world goes back to ancient Greece. The thought of early Greek philosophers centered on the natural world. In addition, 3 pre-Socratic philosophers, Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes, attempted to explain natural phenomena without recourse to creation myths involving the Greek gods. They were called the physikoi, meaning natural philosophers. So you do come across statements and sentences like that. However, a more in-depth study into the details of the beliefs of these Greek natural philosophers will show that on a case-by-case basis, you can find examples where the Greek natural philosophers did in fact mix concepts associated with spirituality in their explanations about nature. So let's start with Thales, who's called the father of Western philosophy. So according to Aristotle, Thales thought that all things were full of gods, as well as gods seen in the movement caused by what came to be known as magnetism and electricity. It seems Thales also had a supreme god which structured the universe. Cicero said that Thales assured that water is the principle of all things and that God is the mind which shaped and created all things from water. So Thales, who is considered the father of natural philosophy and Western civilization, did not separate his ideas about God and spirituality from his explanations about nature. Let's go on to Anaximander. In his desire to find some universal principle, he assumed, like traditional religion, the existence of a cosmic order. And his ideas on this used the old language of myths, which ascribed divine control to various spheres of reality. This was a common practice for the Greek philosophers in a society which saw gods everywhere, and therefore could fit their ideas into a tolerably elastic system. He believed in multiple worlds with different gods to countless worlds. So again, the Greek natural philosopher Anaximander did not separate spirituality from his explanations about the natural world. Let's go into Anaximenes. Anaximenes considered air to be divine in a sense, but he did not associate it with deities or personification. Rather, he just deified the air. He presented air as the first cause that propelled living systems, giving no indication that air itself was caused by anything. So now we have Anaximenes, who did not separate spirituality from his explanations about the natural world. Let's go into Pythagoras. Pythagoras is a well-documented cult leader who created cults around numbers. Pythagoras created a cult-like following that advocated that the universe was made out of numbers. Pythagoras considered numbers sacred, and numbers were worshipped as gods. The monad, or one, was the first god, and the dyad, or two, was the demiurge in Pythagorean philosophy. So Pythagoras did not separate spirituality from his explanations about nature. Let's go into Plato. The Platonic and Neoplatonic philosophy about the nous, meaning mind, intellect, intelligence, or reason, as the demiurge, a deity acting as a scientist, engineer, or divine architect, responsible for fashioning and maintaining the physical universe, which mixes concepts related to science and spirituality, will serve as inspiration for several groups that we discuss along this timeline, including the Romans, Gnostics, Islamic Golden Age, the House of Wisdom, the Freemasons, Rosicrucians, and the Age of Enlightenment. So Plato, he mixed the concepts of spirituality and science by ascribing qualities of a scientist, engineer, or divine architect to his figure of the demiurge, the creator of the universe. The creator of the universe credits the universe using a scientific method in Platonic and Neoplatonic philosophy. Let's go into Democritus, who is credited with natural philosophy of atomism. He was also an advocate of divination. So we have divination associated with Democritus. Next, let's go into Aristotle. In his writing entitled On the Soul, Aristotle discusses the kinds of souls possessed by different living things. Aristotle's proto-biological ideas stuck around in various forms until Darwin getting lumped together under the heading of the great chain of being, that all creatures on earth stand somewhere on a ladder of perfection up towards God. This concept by Aristotle also contributed to scientific racism. So Aristotle not only believed in the soul, but he believed in God and ranked living beings in a hierarchy from the lowest level living being all the way up towards God. So that covers the different Greek natural philosophers. They were not separating spirituality from their explanations about nature. Let's go into the next significant empire that kind of coexisted with ancient Greece on this timeline. Let's go into ancient Rome. So ancient Rome occurred around the same time as ancient Greece, but did not produce nearly as many natural philosophers. The word science is Latin for the word knowledge, which was spoken in Rome, but the Greek word for knowledge is gnosis. It's just ironic that the Greeks produced more natural philosophers who were retroactively called scientists, but we actually don't use the Greek word for knowledge. We use the Roman or Latin word for knowledge, which is science. You know, they don't give the credit to the Greeks in that regard. Now, we do observe that Roman philosophers did create Neoplatonic philosophy based on Plato's natural philosophy, which went on to inspire other groups, as previously mentioned. Notable Roman natural philosophers are Vitruvius, the famous Roman architect and engineer who made multiple references to God in his book entitled De Architectura. Pliny the Elder is a famous Roman natural philosopher who wrote in his text From the Natural History on God that God is all sense, all sight, all hearing, all life, all mind, and all within himself. And then Ptolemy, the famous Roman astronomer and astrologer who dedicated the first principles and models of astronomy to God on an inscription in a temple at Canopus around 146 to 147 AD. So again, we don't see that the Roman natural philosophers have completely separated their explanations about nature from spirituality. Now, the next significant event I want to discuss on this timeline, we're getting into the time of Christianity, but before we get into Christianity, I want to talk about Gnosticism. So Gnosticism, again, as we said, comes from that Greek word gnosis, which means knowledge. Gnosticism was a product of different schools, including early Neoplatonic philosophy and Near East mystery sects merged with early Christianity. In Gnosticism, we see the continuation of this concept of the demiurge, meaning the deity or God, as a scientist, engineer, or grand architect of the universe. So around 300 AD is when Christianity really starts to take off. You have a lot of significant events happening for Christianity right after 300 AD. You have the vision of Constantine. While gazing into the sun, he sees a cross with the words, "By this sign you will conquer," in 312 AD. In 313 AD, you have the Edict of Milan. Christianity becomes a legal religion within the Roman Empire. And then Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire in 380 AD. So about 200 years after Christianity becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire, Europe enters what's called the Dark Ages. The Dark Ages was a point in time in the Middle Ages in Europe after the fall of the Western Roman Empire that are marked by economic, intellectual, and cultural decline. Also during the time of the Dark Ages, the Black Death kills about 50% of the European population. Because of all the death that was occurring during the Dark Ages, this was a point in time in Europe where people were beginning to question the validity of religion, right? When you see so many people dying and you're praying and praying and praying, and that does not seem to be resolving the issue, right? People begin to question, well, is religion even valid? But then at the same time, you have doctors during the time of the Black Death in Europe using spiritual explanations for the cause of the disease. So at this point, science and spirituality still had not been separated in Europe. Now, while Europe was experiencing the Dark Ages, the religion of Islam started, and they were experiencing the Islamic Golden Age in the Middle East. So shortly after Islam started in 610 AD, the Arab trans-Saharan slave trade in Africa started in 650 AD and lasted until about 1500 AD. Now, this is a significant event because it will expose Europe to the idea of mass enslavement of people in Africa. As previously stated, while Europe was experiencing the Dark Ages, the Islamic Arabic world was experiencing a golden age thanks to a desire to translate the natural philosophy of the Greeks. So what started the golden age in Islam was a initiative, a desire to go back and translate all that natural philosophy from the Greeks. When people talk about the Islamic Golden Age, they talk about it as if it was religious beliefs that destroyed the Islamic Golden Age and destroyed the intellectual pursuits that occurred during the Islamic Golden Age. But also, those intellectual pursuits were inspired by religion. It was just different people's perspective on the role of understanding nature in their religion. So the Islamic Golden Age was motivated by religion and destroyed by religion, right? We have Caliph al-Mansur and al-Mamun, who spearheaded natural philosophy or science in Islam. They founded the House of Wisdom, the largest library in the world, in 850 AD. They translated Greek texts. The desire to go back and translate the Greek text, this was actually coming from what's called the first revelation of the Holy Quran that says, read in the name of your Lord. And so their desire to go back and translate all of those Greek texts, they saw it as part of their religious belief to read and understand all information. I think there's a hadith in Islam that says seek knowledge from the cradle to the grave. So that would have been, right in line with their beliefs to have that desire to go back to translate those Greek texts. So the Islamic Golden Age was heavily influenced by Greek rationalism, particularly the philosophy of Aristotle. It's no coincidence that there is a surah in the Quran called An-Najm, Surah 53, which means the star. And during this Islamic Golden Age, there was a heavy focus on astronomy. And so now most of the stars that have names have Arabic names. That was a scientific endeavor that was motivated by their religious beliefs. The group of Muslims that were in favor of natural philosophy or science during the Islamic Golden Age were called the Mu'tazilites. And that group was at odds with another group called the Ash'arites, who believed that the Quran was unchallengeable and God is the only cause, so there was no need for understanding nature outside of the Quran. The key figure in that group was called Al-Ghazali. Al-Ghazali was worried that people would become favorably influenced by these philosophical arguments, and they will come to trust the natural philosophers more than the people in religious power. Al-Ghazali argued that philosophy was incompatible with Islamic teaching, which recognized that nature is entirely subject to God's will. He wrote, "Nothing in nature can act spontaneously apart from the will of God." That sounds like a Muslim. So in the end, the debate between the two groups, Sunni Muslims at the time embraced the ideas of Al-Ghazali, and opposition to natural philosophy in the Islamic world gradually increased to the extent that independent inquiry became a tainted enterprise, sometimes to the point of criminality. But in the late 1200s, early 1300s, at the end of the Islamic Golden Age, scientific or natural philosophy moved from the Middle East to the Islamic empires in Africa, like the Mali Empire and Mansa Musa's Sankore University at Timbuktu. So although that anti-natural philosophy, that anti-scientific sentiment spread in the Middle East, the pro-scientific and pro-natural philosophy sentiment moved into West Africa. Mansa Musa's pilgrimage to Mecca also exposed European merchants to the gold and wealth in Africa. And the story of Mansa Musa's gold and wealth spread throughout Europe in the following years, serving as motivation for European explorers to travel to Africa in search of gold. So the next significant event that occurs on this timeline is the Crusades. Many people know that the Crusades was basically a war between European Christians and Middle Eastern Muslims. Europe's interaction with the Islamic world during the Crusades served as the impetus to the Renaissance. Europeans saw the greatness that the Arab world was able to achieve using the Greco-Roman natural philosophy, and this inspired Europeans to revisit that information. The religious wars that were the Crusades served as the impetus for anti-religious sentiment later on, and the development of secret societies to practice religious and spiritual beliefs in secret without fear of persecution. During the Crusades, we also saw the beginnings of what can be called pan-Europeanism, where various nations, various ethnicities in Europe united to fight a foreign cause during the Crusades. The next significant event is the Renaissance in Europe. So let's understand where we are in time. So Europe experienced these dark ages. While they were experiencing the dark ages, Islam was experiencing a golden age because they had translated the Greek natural philosophy. And then when the Christian Europeans went to war with the Arab Muslims, the Christian Europeans saw how well the Arab Muslims were doing, and they decided, okay, yeah, we need to get back to that natural philosophy too, to improve the conditions of things throughout Europe. So the Renaissance is characterized by an effort to revive and surpass the ideas and achievements of classical antiquity. The Renaissance starts in Italy and then moves to northern European nations. The Renaissance was a pan-European movement which took place in the Western European countries of England, France, Germany, Italy, Poland, Portugal, Spain, and Scotland, where all of these groups were different ethnicities and different tribes. They looked physically different. They even looked different from the Greeks and Romans, but they united under what can be called pan-Europeanism. There was actually a point in time in America where Greeks and Italians, Greeks and Romans, were not considered white, racially white in America. And so that just goes to show, like, people are having debates about whether certain African ethnicities should be considered racially black. Pan-Europeanism grew out of an idea that everybody on the European continent was one, regardless if they were white or not, right? So similarly, Pan-Africanism can unite Africa and the African diaspora, all the ethnicities from Africa and the African diaspora, regardless if they are racially identified as black. So let's talk about some of the natural philosophers that came up in the Renaissance and how these natural philosophers mix spirituality with science. So the first one we want to highlight is Copernicus. Copernicus was a Polish mathematician, astronomer, and Catholic during the Renaissance period. In his commentary on Psalms 93:1, he states, "How could the earth hang suspended in the air were it not upheld by God's hand? And by what means could it maintain itself unmoved, while the heavens above are in constant rapid motion? Did not its divine maker fix and establish it?" So again, that's the natural philosopher Copernicus, who again is using the concept of God in his explanation about astronomy. The next significant figure we want to talk about is Francis Bacon. Francis Bacon is always mentioned as a key figure in influencing and informing the modern scientific method. Bacon was also a devout Anglican. In Francis Bacon's book, The New Atlantis, he writes about a concept called Solomon's house. Again, Solomon, the biblical character. In the Bible, Solomon is called Solomon the Wise. And in Francis Bacon's New Atlantis book, Solomon's house is supposed to be a central organization like the Invisible College of the Rosicrucians that organizes all knowledge and all human wisdom. Francis Bacon's idea for Solomon's house and the Invisible College eventually will give rise to the Royal Society. Next, let's deal with Galileo, who was an Italian astronomer, physicist, engineer, and Roman Catholic during the Renaissance period. Galileo wrote a letter explaining that the Bible and nature did not disagree. One was God's words to the masses, a story about how to behave and why. The other was God's work, the physical reality that God created. So Galileo mixed concepts related to spirituality and science. Next, let's talk about Kepler. Kepler saw the sun as a symbol of God the Father at the center of things, moving planets faster when they came closer. So Kepler was another one who mixed science and spirituality. Next, let's go to Rene Descartes, who was a French natural philosopher, mathematician, and Roman Catholic during the Renaissance period. Rene Descartes was influential in forming the modern scientific method. However, on the night of September 16, 1620, Descartes had a dream where an angel appeared to him, and the angel said to Descartes, "The conquest of nature is to be achieved through measure and number," and that revelation laid the basis for modern science. So Rene Descartes believed in angels. He had a dream where an angel came to him and basically told him about the significance of using mathematics in understanding nature. So Rene Descartes mixing science and spirituality. The next significant event that we need to discuss is called the Age of Discovery. So as previously stated, Mansa Musa's pilgrimage to Mecca is what motivated Europeans to come to Africa in search of gold. People saw how much gold that Mansa Musa was showing off and flexing and spending. So the Europeans said, well, there must be gold in Africa, so we need to go down there to find it. Again, it's well known. We learned this in middle school. We learned this in high school, that the motivation for Europeans' conquest was what? God, gold, and glory. It wasn't science, it wasn't natural philosophy, it was spirituality. God, the first thing. God, gold, and glory, which motivated European exploration and conquest during the Age of Discovery. The technology that Europeans used for exploration, they actually acquired that technology from other cultures. And the technology that they acquired, which they used for exploration, that technology was invented for spiritual purposes, right? So on the Silk Road to China, Europe acquired two key inventions for exploration from the Chinese. One is the compass. This was invented in China as a spiritual device used to determine where to place a grave. The other key invention used for conquest was gunpowder. This was invented by a Chinese alchemist who was looking for an elixir for immortality. So those two key inventions were invented for spiritual purposes. The compass enabled Europe to navigate for exploration, and the gunpowder obviously powered their firearms for conquest. And then their interactions with the Arabs during the Crusades. Europe acquired the astrolabe, which was used to help navigate. The astrolabe was introduced to Western Europe by Arabs who used the astrolabe to determine the best time for prayer. And then the caravel ships that the Portuguese used with the triangular sails, that was actually introduced to Portugal by the Arabs. So during the Age of Discovery, this is when European colonization of Africa occurs, and this is also when the transatlantic slave trade starts. So another significant organization that occurs in Europe is Freemasonry. So although Freemasonry has many mythological and unverified origins, the best evidence suggests that Freemasonry starts in Europe with early Mason guilds, operative Mason guilds during the Dark Ages. But the earliest evidence for a lodge in Europe is the Grand Lodge of Scotland in Edinburgh.
Now, who are Freemasons? Well, we have a few requirements to become a Mason, and that goes well back into history, but they're very simple. And the second one, and this is key, is you must be able to express some sort of belief in deity. That means you have to have a spiritual viewpoint. And we don't ask any other questions. We don't ask you to define that. We don't ask you to clarify. And there's no tests of even what you mean by that. Where does Freemasonry come from? Now, the best evidence we have, the best case I can offer you, suggests that it pretty much begins in the form we have it in the Middle Ages, with the guilds that were practicing actual stone masonry. Now, I've used the word operative several times. I'm going to use a couple more. Accepted in speculative masonry. Up to this point, everything we're dealing with are Masons, Middle Ages, early Renaissance, who are actually practicing stone masonry. They're building things. We have two words that show up in the 1600s. The first is the word accepted. And an accepted Mason, but an accepted Mason was a Mason who did not work on stone and would never work on stone in a practical sense, but was going to be made a Mason, made a apprentice and fellowcraft of a lodge, perhaps initially as an honor. We have a couple of significant ones that pop up a lot in Masonic history. Robert Moray was an accepted Mason. He was initiated May 20th, 1641, that's tomorrow, several hundred years ago, in London by a group of Scottish Masons from Edinburgh. And Robert Moray was one of the founders of the Royal Society. He was a natural philosopher. He was an early scientist, a rationalist, kind of a critical thinker, a very intelligent man. Elias Ashmole is another one. He's well known as the first English speculative Mason because Robert Moray was from Scotland. Elias Ashmole, June 1646, he was brought into a lodge. He was made an apprentice and fellowcraft on the same night. He was also a founder of the Royal Society, a natural philosopher, and well known as an alchemist, mentioned a couple times in Harry Potter. Now, there was already a presence of older and larger lodges issuing charters and organizing lodges in their area. The big one that you'll stumble on in Masonic history is Kilwinning. We now call that Kilwinning number nothing because it's as elite, it's zero because it's earlier than the first. But it's a Scottish lodge, and English Masons aren't really thrilled with the idea that Scottish Masonry is much older, but it is. Kilwinning number nothing is at least as old as 1598, and they have consistent, continuous written minutes back to 1642.
The Freemasons mix symbols associated with science and spirituality in their symbol called the square and compass. And this is taken directly from Wikipedia. The square and compass is the single most identifiable symbol of Freemasonry. Both the square and compasses are architects' tools and used in Masonic rituals as emblems to teach symbolic lessons. I'll also say that the square and compass, the tools themselves, are used throughout the different STEM fields, not just in architecture. The square and compass is used in science, is used in engineering, is used in mathematics. So they are tools of STEM. So in the Wikipedia article goes on to say, in many English-speaking countries, the square and compass are depicted with the letter G in the center. This has multiple meanings representing different words depending on the context in which it is discussed. The most common is that the G stands for God. Another is that it stands for geometry, and is to remind Masons that geometry and Freemasonry are synonymous terms, described as being the noblest of sciences, and the basis upon which the superstructure of Freemasonry and everything in existence in the entire universe is erected. In this context, it can also stand for Great Architect of the Universe, a non-denominational reference to God. So in the symbol of the Freemasonry, you have the G referencing God, or the great architect of the universe, the demiurge that comes from Gnosticism, and you have the compass and the square, basically symbols related to science and spirituality, hidden in plain sight, or playing in your face, as the young people say. So Freemasonry mixes science with spirituality. In addition to Freemasons, there were other secret societies that came up in Europe during this time that mixed science with spirituality, another one being the Oculist Secret Society. Now, another very influential secret society which mixed science and spirituality we have to talk about is the Rosicrucians, which come on the scene in about 1610 AD. The Rosicrucians, they mix concepts related to spirituality and science and influence the Age of Enlightenment. You even hear the influence in the title of the name of the period, Enlightenment. We'll talk about that more shortly. The idea of the Rosicrucians, exemplified by the network of astronomers, professors, mathematicians, and natural philosophers in 16th century Europe, promoted by such men as Kepler, John Dee, and Tycho Brahe, gave rise to the Invisible College. This was the precursor to the Royal Society, founded in 1660. The Rosicrucians basically gave birth to the Age of Enlightenment. They claimed to have hidden knowledge based on esoteric truths of an ancient past that could reveal astonishing insights about the true workings of the universe and the human body. They hoped to unify all humankind with their secret knowledge. They captured the zeitgeist in Europe by the dawn of the 17th century, and many publications envisioned great breakthroughs in alchemy, science, and medicine. However, no one outwardly ever claimed to be a member of the Rosicrucians. Several manifestos written by a man named Christian Rosecross about philosophy, alchemy, magic, healing the sick, ending war, and hidden forces in nature, and harnessing nature's powers. The manifestos were works of fiction, but captivated intellectual circles and great thinkers in Europe. They were intrigued by the idea of bending nature to man's will. However, they were motivated and inspired by fiction. The myth gave rise to true believers. Robert Flood, who was a renowned chemist, astrologer, mystic, and supporter of all things Rosicrucian during this time period. In what British scholar Francis Yates calls the Rosicrucian Enlightenment, the spirit of hands-on investigation called for by this idealized group helped inspire the loose collaboration of pioneering natural scientists that 17th century British chemist Robert Boyle called the Invisible College. Rosicrucianism was first presented to the world cloaked in mysticism, but its lasting impact was to lay the groundwork for modern science based on the experimental method. Other secret societies that come up around this time also is the Bavarian Illuminati, founded by Adam Weishaupt. But understand that all of these terms, right? Science, gnosis, knowledge, enlightenment, illumination, all of these terms are associated with knowledge, right? And so the next significant period that we have to discuss is called the Age of Enlightenment. The word gnosis, as in Gnostic, is Greek for knowledge. Science is Latin for knowledge. Enlightenment is symbolic of knowledge. Illumination is symbolic of knowledge. All of these things are different words associated with the same concept. During the Age of Enlightenment is when we start having discussions in Europe about the separation of what they call the occult sciences, namely astrology, alchemy, and nature magic, from natural philosophy, right? This occurs during the Enlightenment. However, many notable natural philosophers like Isaac Newton still studied, practiced, and wrote publications about alchemy. During the Age of Enlightenment, abolition of slavery also began to be discussed. It was during this time when different scientific societies were coming into existence where natural philosophers could debate and exchange ideas, right? We talked about the Royal Society of London. There also was the Academy of Sciences in Paris in 1666. But the most noteworthy natural philosopher during the Age of Enlightenment was Isaac Newton. However, Isaac Newton did not separate natural philosophy from spirituality or science from spirituality.
Newton thought the Holy Trinity was nonsense. He believed he had unique access to a secret treasure of wisdom, both religious and scientific, passed down from God to Noah, then to Moses, then Pythagoras, and then to himself. Newton was also a major alchemist, as were his buddies Robert Boyle and John Locke. But Newton was obsessed with alchemy, or thinking philosophically about stuff by changing it. While he didn't view alchemy as separate from his more scientific-looking investigations into what is stuff, he didn't stray far from the alchemical mainstream. He kept furnaces burning for days on end, transmuting metals. In fact, the largest section of his complete works concerns alchemy. That said, Newton wasn't interested in trying to turn lead into gold. He was just trying to understand everything.
So Isaac Newton did not separate science from spirituality. So the next significant event we want to talk about on this timeline is the scientific revolution, which led into the Industrial Revolution. Historian Peter Harrison attributes Christianity to having contributed to the rise of the scientific revolution. Historians of science have long known that religious factors played a significantly positive role in the emergence and persistence of modern science in the West. Not only were many of the key figures in the rise of science individuals with sincere religious commitments, but the new approaches to nature that they pioneered were underpinned in various ways by religious assumptions. Yet, many of the leading figures in the scientific revolution imagined themselves to be champions of a science that was more compatible with Christianity than the medieval ideas about the natural world that they replaced. And this is from the Wikipedia article on the scientific revolution. Some scholars have noted a direct tie between particular aspects of traditional Christianity and the rise of science. And that's from the book entitled Seeking Peace in the Warfare Between Science and Theology by Mark Knoll and A.D. White. Next, we want to just touch on the Industrial Revolution. So again, the Industrial Revolution comes about at the time of natural philosophy. That is, concepts that we now associated with science, associated with mysticism, the occult, and concepts related to spirituality, right? So all of these inventions come during the Industrial Revolution, which were developed during the time of natural philosophy. The steam engine in 1712, the battery in 1799, the cotton gin in 1794, the locomotive in 1804, the electric arc lamp in 1807, the camera in 1825, the photograph in 1826, the typewriter in 1829, the electric generator in 1831, and the telegraph in 1836. All of those inventions came about during the time of natural philosophy. So now we've finally made it up to 1834, where William Whewell coins the term scientist, and the term starts to be used more widely in 1840. Charles Darwin, he was actually alive during the transition from natural philosophy to science. One of the key books that Darwin read as a student was entitled Preliminary Discourse on the Study of Natural Philosophy, which was written in 1831, which described the highest aim of natural philosophy as understanding such laws through inductive reasoning based on observation. Perhaps one of the most important scientists that came about after 1834 was Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein's perspective on science and religion is encapsulated in one of his famous quotes that says, "Science without religion is lame, and religion without science is blind." And then one of the famous science communicators, Carl Sagan, said that science is not only compatible with spirituality, it is a profound source of spirituality. So Carl Sagan actually saw science as his form of spirituality. Right, so we've covered the whole timeline. So now, in conclusion, let's answer some of the questions that were posed at the beginning of the video. Did separating science from religion/spirituality empower Europe? I would say no, right? Again, and this is based on studying history, because Europe became a global power during the time when concepts that we now associate with science were still intertwined and intermixed with concepts associated with spirituality under the heading of natural philosophy. I would say that the key event which empowered Europe was the Crusades, because through the Crusades, Europe was able to obtain three keys which empowered them. One was the motivation for the Renaissance, right? During the Crusades, Europe came in contact with the Arab Muslim world, which was experiencing their golden age because they translated the philosophy from the Greeks. So Europe's entire motivation for the Renaissance came through their interaction with the Arab world during the Crusades. During the Crusades, Europe also obtained technology that they used for exploration and colonization in the form of the astrolabe for navigation and sailing technology, right? And Europe got their inspiration for the transatlantic slave trade from the Arab Muslim world's trans-Saharan slave trade in Africa. I would say what empowers Europe more than anything, or what has empowered Europe more than anything, is being able to identify certain valuable aspects from different cultures and ethnicities and appropriate it into their culture and build on it, right? You know, we've talked a lot about Greek philosophy, but even the Greeks, they got to where they were because they were able to take certain lessons that they received from the ancient Egyptians and build on it. So Europe has a long history of achieving success through the appropriation of technology, information, talent, resources from other cultures and other ethnicities, and then building upon it, right? So the important lesson that we can take from Europe is the importance of collaboration, right? Being willing to learn from everybody. Can you mix science and religion? The answer is yes. There's literally 2,400 years of history of it being done in Western civilization alone. And then if we wanted to add ancient Egypt, we can include an additional 3,000 years of history mixing science and religion. Now, I think a better question or a better idea to ponder is, should you mix science with religion and spirituality, right? Because whether or not it can be done, the word can is a capability question. And we have history that it can be done successfully. You know, literally an industrial revolution took place in the Western world at a point in time when science and spirituality was still being mixed. So a better question is, should you mix science with religion and spirituality, right? If you say that it should not be done, well, then you just have to give your reasons. But again, one of those reasons cannot be that mixing science and spirituality hinders production, because we literally have thousands of years of history to the contrary. Moreover, science still has not been completely separated from religion and spirituality in present day. I've talked in multiple videos in the past about scientific terminology, scientific nomenclature coming from the names of deities, right? Then even if you look to the Large Hadron Collider, there's a statue of the Hindu deity Shiva that's right in front of CERN, in front of the Large Hadron Collider, right? So there's still this intermixing occurring between science and spirituality. You know, to answer the question if you should mix science and spirituality, something that should be considered is what religious or spiritual tradition is being mixed with science and spirituality, and what is the purpose and reason for doing it, right? In modern education, there's now this term and this concept called STEAM, which is science, technology, engineering, arts, and mathematics. STEAM basically uses art to teach science, technology, engineering, and math. Mythology, allegory, fiction, all of those are forms of art. Religious art is a genre of art. So the mere inclusion of art with science, technology, engineering, and math opens the door to mix religious art, religious mythology with science, technology, engineering, and math. So STEAM education also facilitates the mixing of science and spirituality through art. When we're answering the question if it's good or if you should mix science and spirituality, we have to consider that we saw how during the Renaissance in Europe, different organizations formed which mix science and religious/spiritual traditions. And this gave birth to the Age of Enlightenment, the scientific revolution, and the first industrial revolution in Western civilization. We've also seen how Europe was able to learn from other cultures and ethnicities and build on what made those other cultures successful. Now let's take those two lessons and apply them to Africans and people of African descent. So when it comes to Africans and people of African descent, when it comes to the global African diaspora, can a similar approach be taken for Africa, right? Can we learn from Europe and what brought them into power? Can we mix African religion, African spirituality with science in order to bring about an African scientific revolution and an African industrial revolution? My hypothesis is yes, and my experiment to test that hypothesis has been the African Creation Energy series of books and videos. So that's all I have to say on this topic. Thank you for your time and attention. Peace.